If you're listening to this, you're probably the kind of person who likes to dig a little deeper,
Mm.
likes to understand, what's really going on beneath the surface of the news. And lately, well, one thing that's been impossible to ignore is all this talk about Alberta and separating from Canada.
Yeah, it's definitely been picking up steam, and it's not just like, casual conversation anymore. There's actually a delegation heading down to Washington to explore possibilities.
Yeah, possibly even meeting with the Trump administration. That's what we're hearing. So for this deep dive, we're going right to the heart of this whole Alberta separation thing. What are the actual arguments for and against? Our goal here isn't to tell you what to think. You can make up your own mind. We just want to lay it all out there, give you the facts, straight from the sources we've got.
It's important to cut through all the noise and, all the strong opinions out there. The rhetoric can get pretty heated, so we're going to focus on the actual information.
Right. So let's start with why some people think Alberta would be better off on its own. And right away, the economic arguments jump out. Like there's this strong sentiment, especially in sources like the Northwest Cavalryman, that Alberta is getting a raw deal economically, almost like a colony, they say.
It really boils down to this feeling that Alberta contributes so much to Canada, especially through its natural resources, but they don't necessarily see that reflected in federal policies or, the benefits they get back.
It's not just a vague sense of unfairness either. The Alberta Prosperity Project, and this is quoted in the Northwest Cavalryman, they use some pretty strong language. They say Canadian federalism has basically turned Alberta into and I'm quoting here, a colony of Quebec and Ontario. So why this comparison? What's the historical and economic baggage behind that?
Well, it comes from this belief that the policies coming from the federal government, especially around resource development and how revenues are shared, that these policies end up disproportionately benefiting other provinces. And historically, it's no secret that Alberta's resources have been a huge part of the Canadian economy, right? And the feeling now for some is that, the province isn't seeing the benefits of that contribution in a way that feels, fair or balanced.
And then there's the whole issue of equalization payments. Always a hot topic. The Western Standard, they quote the Alberta delegation, who are saying Alberta pays way more than any other province. And they're just done with it. They don't want to subsidize other large provinces that they say should be able to fund themselves. What's the main point of their argument against this system?
Basically, they argue that Alberta's wealth is being redistributed to provinces that don't really need that kind of support anymore, and that this is actually holding Alberta back, preventing them from investing in their own economy and creating opportunities for Albertans. And when they talk about, tens of billions of Alberta tax dollars going to Quebec, it really strikes a nerve with a lot of people.
Yeah, and it's not just about the money, right?
Yeah.
The Northwest Cavalrymen, they even claim that Alberta is funding better social services in Quebec than what Albertans themselves have access to. And all this while Alberta is having to borrow money. It kind of creates this image of a system that's really out of whack.
Right. It's a narrative that resonates with a lot of people in Alberta. They feel like they're paying for a higher quality of life somewhere else while they're facing financial struggles themselves. So naturally, that leads to a lot of talk about what separating could do for Alberta, economically speaking. At least, that's what the proponents are saying.
Yeah, exactly. And the Alberta Independence Delegation, this is again from the Western Standard, they lay out these almost unbelievably huge potential benefits, keeping $69 billion in taxes and pensions every year, getting back $339 billion in pension funds, and getting rid of all kinds of federal taxes. They even say gas and diesel would be way cheaper. Where are these numbers coming from? They sound amazing, but is it realistic?
Well, their calculations assume an independent Alberta keeps all the taxes it collects, within its own borders, and that it gets control of its share of federal assets like pension funds. Theoretically, eliminating federal taxes would mean more money in Albertans' pockets. But we have to be realistic here. These are projections from, people who are advocating for separation. It's very hard to predict exactly what would happen economically if a new country was formed. There are just so many factors involved.
Right. And the Western Standard also talks about Alberta switching to the U.S. dollar, saying the Canadian dollar would basically become worthless without them, like a Canadian peso, they called it.
Yeah.
And they think this would help with trade. What's the logic behind that?
Well, they're arguing that if Alberta, which is such a big part of the Canadian economy, were to leave, the Canadian dollar would obviously take a huge hit. And they see adopting the U.S. dollar as a way to stabilize things, reduce the risk from fluctuating exchange rates. And of course, it strengthens ties with the U.S., which is Alberta's biggest trading partner. But there's a flip side, too. They would lose control over their own monetary policy.
And they paint this, like, almost utopian vision of a Commonwealth of Alberta with close ties to the U.S., a constitution like Texas, and basically becoming the richest place in the world. It's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah, it's definitely a very optimistic view. Their idea is that with complete economic independence and, a really business-friendly environment, Alberta would attract tons of investment and experience this, like, explosive growth. But you have to remember, this is a best-case scenario. It's what the people who support separation are hoping for. In reality, it's impossible to say for sure how things would play out. There are so many variables.
Okay. So we've talked about the economics, but it's not just about the money, is it? There's this whole feeling of political alienation, like not being heard by the government. The Northwest Cavalrymen and the Western Standard, they both talk about being fed up with being governed by idiots in Ontario and Quebec. Why is this such a strong sentiment?
Well, it reflects a deep frustration. Like, there's a sense that the values and priorities of the people in Alberta, their political culture, it's just different from the political establishment in central Canada. And they feel like federal policies are often designed with, Ontario and Quebec in mind, maybe even at the expense of Alberta.
And Jeffrey Rath, he's the lawyer heading up the delegation to Washington. He's quoted in the Western Standard, criticizing politicians in Ottawa for not understanding Alberta's energy sector and making bad decisions because of it. How big of a deal is this whole energy issue for the separatist movement?
It's huge. It's been a point of contention for years. The feeling in Alberta is that, all these federal regulations, all these environmental policies, they're actually hurting their most important industry, which is, of course, vital to their economy. So when they feel like the federal government doesn't get it, doesn't support them, it creates this feeling of alienation.
And it's not just energy, right? The Northwest Cavalrymen, they also talk about how frustrated they are with how the federal government handles trade with the U.S., which obviously is super important for Alberta's exports.
Absolutely. When they see what they perceive as mismanagement or a lack of focus on their interests when it comes to trade, it just adds to that feeling that, the federal government isn't representing them well on the national stage. That phrase they use in the Western Standard, Laurentian elites, it really captures that sense of being overlooked, being dismissed by the political establishment in Eastern Canada.
And all of this is clearly why this delegation is going to Washington, to explore options,
Right.
like actual independence or even becoming a state in the U.S. That's what the Western Standard and Fox News are saying. And the fact they're saying, like, Canada is no longer viable as a country, that's a pretty serious statement. What do you think they're hoping to accomplish with this trip?
It seems like they're genuinely looking for alternatives. They're really dissatisfied with how things are working within the Canadian Federation. So by going to the U.S. and talking to people there, they're signaling that they're ready to consider options outside of Canada. Of course, whether those options are actually realistic, well, that's a whole other question. And there would be huge implications both for Alberta and for Canada if they were to actually go down that path.
And then you have Premier Danielle Smith. She's making all these demands of the federal government. And according to the Western Standard, she's even hinting at an independence referendum if they don't meet her demands. What does all this tell us?
Well, it shows that the Alberta government is taking a much tougher stance. They're not messing around. They want to see some serious changes in how things work between the province and the federal government. And by bringing up the possibility of a referendum, it shows they're at least willing to consider giving Albertans a chance to decide their own future.
And the timeline they're talking about is pretty ambitious. Establishing a Commonwealth of Alberta by December 15, 2025, with a focus on getting that independence referendum done. According to the Western Standard. Seems like they want to move quickly.
Yeah, there's a real sense of urgency there. For the people who really believe in this, it's not some abstract idea for the distant future. They want to see action, and they want to see it soon. The timeline might be ambitious, but it definitely shows how strongly some people feel about this.
One last thing on the arguments for separation. Fox News mentioned this idea that Albertans feel more culturally connected to, like, Montana than they do to Ottawa. How does that fit into the whole picture?
It's about feeling like you belong, like your values and lifestyle align with a certain place. And for some Albertans, they see those shared values, that sense of shared history and way of life, more in a place like Montana than they do in other parts of Canada. It's a bit less tangible than the economic or political arguments, but it definitely contributes to that feeling of having a distinct identity, a separate identity. And it makes the idea of closer ties with a different political entity, well, more appealing to some.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about the arguments for Alberta going it alone, but there's another side to this story. Why do some people think Alberta is better off staying in Canada? Let's talk about that. And right off the bat, there's some pretty significant legal and constitutional hurdles, right?
Definitely. You can't just, up and leave a country. The Alberta Sovereignty within it United Canada Act, if you go to the alberta.ca website, they make it very clear. It says, and I'm quoting here, will not allow Alberta to separate from Canada and will not allow Alberta to defy Canada's constitution. That's a pretty fundamental point to understand. The Act, despite its name, is really about protecting Alberta's interests within Canada.
Yeah. So even though they use this strong language about sovereignty, the actual act, if you read what the Alberta government says about it, it's designed to give them a legal way to stand up for their interests within the existing system, to push back against federal laws that they think are harmful or unconstitutional. It's about working within the system, not breaking away from it.
Exactly. It's a tool for Alberta to assert its own jurisdiction as a province, to challenge what they see as overreach from the federal government. But it's all within the framework of the Canadian Constitution, and they make it clear that they respect the role of the courts. The process they lay out with the Legislative Assembly, the debates, the votes, the legal reviews, all of that, it shows that they're committed to working within the current legal system.
So it might feel like a step towards more autonomy, but legally speaking, it's about strengthening Alberta's position inside Canada. What about the economic side? What are the arguments for sticking with Canada economically?
Well, you have to think about the risks that come with separation. And there's an article in the Hub that talks about Quebec separatism. Obviously, it's not directly about Alberta, but it raises some really relevant points. They found that most people in Quebec believe that if they were to separate, it would create a lot of economic problems. Businesses would leave, people would lose their jobs. And it's reasonable to think that Alberta might face similar challenges.
That makes sense. I mean, economic stability is a huge factor in any decision this big. And the Hub also points out that a large majority of Canadians, like 65%, they believe that their province would be worse off if it became part of the U.S. Now, that's not about independence exactly, but it does show that people generally see value in the current Canadian system, both economically and politically.
Yeah, it suggests that people recognize the benefits of being part of Canada, and they're not necessarily eager to, get closer to the U.S., whether it's through statehood or some other arrangement. There's a certain level of trust in the existing structure.
And what about public opinion in Alberta itself? How many people actually want to separate?
The Hub did a report called the Western Identity Report, and it's got some interesting data. It shows that only about 20% of people in both Alberta and Saskatchewan actually want to leave Canada and form their own country. So even though there's a lot of talk about separation, it's not actually a majority view, not even close.
That's a really important point, and it kind of puts things in perspective, right?
Yeah.
Even in Quebec, where they've had this long history of separatist movements, the Hub found that 84% of Quebecers don't think independence is likely to happen in the next 3 years. So
Wow.
it's not just an Alberta thing. Regional frustrations exist all over Canada,
Yeah.
but that doesn't necessarily translate into a desire to actually break away.
Right. And then you have Prime Minister Trudeau. He's been very clear about his stance on this whole Alberta joining the U.S. thing. He said, and this is quoted in the Western Standard and Fox News, that there's not a snowball's chance in hell that Canada will ever be the 51st state. So politically speaking, there are some pretty big obstacles to overcome.
So let's wrap this up by looking at what Alberta can do to address its concerns without actually leaving Canada. What are some of the options within the existing system?
Well, we have to come back to the Alberta Sovereignty within a United Canada Act. Like we discussed, it's meant to be a legal framework for Alberta to protect its interests and make sure the division of powers between the federal and provincial governments is respected. The Alberta.ca website really emphasizes that it's about addressing federal overreach while still working within the Constitution and the court system.
And Premier Smith herself, in the Western Standard, she said that her caucus is committed to a strong and sovereign Alberta within a united Canada. But she also acknowledges that some Albertans feel ignored, disenfranchised. So it seems like the official position of the government is to find solutions within the current federal system.
Yeah. And she also pointed to the citizen-initiated referendum law in Alberta. She said that's the right way for people to raise the issue of independence if they want to. That way, all Albertans would have a say, and it would all happen through a democratic process that already exists in Canada.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The big takeaway is that there's this tension, right? On one hand, you have this desire in Alberta for more control, more autonomy, and a feeling that they're not getting a fair shake economically. But on the other hand, there are the legal and economic realities of staying in Canada, and the fact that separating isn't actually that popular among Albertans themselves.
Exactly. And we have to be clear. We're not trying to tell anyone what to think. We've just presented the information, the arguments from different sides based on the sources we've got. We're leaving it up to you to decide what you believe.
Absolutely. So here's something to think about as we leave this deep dive. Given everything we've discussed, and considering that even the Sovereignty Act has its limits, what are the most realistic paths for Alberta to get what it wants within Canada? Or are the arguments for looking outside of Canada really that strong? What would the future look like? It's a question with huge implications, not just for Alberta, but for the whole country.